They say you truly know someone when the doors are closed and the world isn't watching. I used to believe I knew my husband, Richard Rick, as everyone called him, but that belief was shattered the night he turned the key and locked me in our basement, like I was nothing more than an object to be discarded. At 78 years old now, I still dream of that moment, not because of the fear, though that was real, but because of the silence that followed, the terrifying, endless silence that wrapped around me like a second skin. My name is Linda Anderson, and I live alone in Port Townsend, Washington. People here know me as the elderly woman who tends her roses and walks to the post office each morning like clockwork. Some even smile and wave. They don't know the story. Not really. They don't know that I once lived in the shadows of a man who smiled in public and snarled in private. A man who could cook a roast like a Southern gentleman, then lock his wife beneath the floorboards before dessert was served. I was born in 1947, raised just outside Tacoma, and married Rick when I was 24. He was charming at least. That's what everyone said. He came from a respected family, had a steady job at the shipping docks, and carried himself with a calm, assured confidence that made people trust him easily. I was swept up in it. We met at a county dance, and within 6 months, we were standing under a white gazebo exchanging vows. We moved into a 2-story craftsman house in Port Townsend, just off Cherry Street. It had a view of the Sound, an apple tree in the backyard, and a basement that smelled like cedar and old paint. At first, I felt lucky. He handled the bills, fixed the car, and made sure the lawn stayed neat. I baked, kept the house warm, and hosted quiet dinners for the neighbors. From the outside, we were the picture of small-town stability. But even early on, there were signs. Rick never liked me talking too long with neighbors. He didn't approve of me working, even part-time. When I wrote letters to my sister in Spokane, he'd ask to read them just to be sure nothing personal was being aired. It didn't feel like love. It felt like control wearing a silk tie. Still, I stayed. We didn't have children, something Rick blamed me for, though doctors never found anything wrong. I learned to fold myself into silence, to survive within the rules he created. For years, I thought maybe that was just what marriage looked like behind closed doors. But then came the night everything changed. It was March. A cold, damp wind howled off the Sound that evening. We'd had another one of those arguments this time about a checkbook I'd balanced wrong. He didn't yell. Rick never yelled. Instead, his voice went quiet and low, like the wind before a thunderstorm. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairs, holding a laundry basket, when he reached past me and pulled the door shut. I heard the key twist, once, then twice. "Rick," I called out. No answer. The sound of his footsteps receding up the hallway chilled me more than the cold concrete beneath my feet. I jiggled the doorknob. I called again. Rick, silence. That night, I sat on the bottom step in the dark, my fingers clenched tight around my house keys, pointless now, and my thoughts scrambled in 100 directions. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he'd had too much to drink and would realize what he'd done. But hours passed, then days, and I began to understand something no woman wants to admit, especially not after decades of marriage. He didn't just lose control. He planned this. I wish I could say that was the worst of it. But what he did after locking me down there, that's the part no one was ready for. It's strange how a marriage can look perfect from the outside while quietly bleeding on the inside. That was my life for nearly 5 decades. People in Port Townsend used to say, Rick and I were a solid couple, dependable, steady. Neighbors would smile and wave as we passed on Sunday walks. We'd host little potlucks on the porch. They never saw the way his hand tightened on my shoulder when I spoke out of turn, or how I flinched every time he raised his voice. The signs were always there, though I just didn't want to see them. When I first met Richard Rick Anderson, I was 24 and working as a secretary for a small insurance agency in Tacoma. Rick was 30, tall and clean-shaven, with a voice that never wavered. He wore dark button-down shirts and always kept his shoes polished. He had this presence like someone who knew what he wanted and got it. We met at a friend's engagement party. He asked if he could walk me home, and I remember feeling a little flutter in my chest. It had been a long time since anyone made me feel chosen. He talked about his job down at the docks and how he wanted to find a quiet place to build a life. He said he admired how I carried myself, said I reminded him of the kind of woman a man could build a future with. By our third date, he already had plans for our house. By the fifth, he was asking about marriage. Looking back, I wonder if he ever saw me as a person or just a role to be filled. We married that same year. I moved with him to Port Townsend, where he'd bought a 2-story home near the water. The view was stunning. The house was older, but charming, with stained glass windows, a steep staircase, and, yes, that basement with the thick oak door and iron lock I barely gave a second thought to back then. At first, Rick was attentive. He brought me roses every Friday, cooked on weekends, fixed anything that broke with his own hands. The neighbors thought he was a dream husband, and I wanted to believe that too, but slowly, his affection turned to control. He started making decisions without me: what groceries to buy, what color to paint the walls, whether we should have guests over. At first, it was subtle. "You don't need to worry about this. Honey," he'd say, "I've got it under control." And I wanted to believe he was just being protective. But then came the rules. No phone calls longer than 10 minutes. No new dresses unless he approved them. No friends over unless he was home. Safety, he said. Decency. And I, naive and unsure of myself, let those rules shape my days. I stopped writing to my sister, Nancy, because he said it was unhealthy to dwell on childhood. I quit my job when he hinted I was more needed at home. I began to second-guess everything: what I wore, how I spoke, when I smiled, and always, I told myself it was just how marriage worked. After all, he didn't hit me, not physically, not then, but the emotional bruises came fast and deep. He criticized the way I folded the laundry, the way I walked, my voice, my thoughts. He belittled me in whispers so quiet. No one else would hear, but sharp enough to echo in my head for hours afterward. One afternoon, I told him I wanted to take an art class at the community center. I had seen the flyer pinned outside the library and felt an old spark, something that had been asleep in me for years. But when I mentioned it at dinner, Rick put down his fork slowly and looked at me as if I'd suggested something ridiculous. Art. At your age, he said with a chuckle that chilled my spine, Linda, darling, that's a waste of time and gas money. You have a house to run. I didn't go. Over the years, I faded from the woman I had been, bright, independent, with a love for reading and writing, into someone who merely functioned. I told myself things could be worse. At least he provided. At least the roof didn't leak. At least there was food on the table. But the loneliness was unbearable. He never wanted children, said they were too noisy, too much work. I longed for a baby, someone to love, someone to protect, but that door, like so many others, was firmly shut by Rick's quiet authority. The house became a silent battlefield. Every room held a memory of compromise, of swallowed words and abandoned dreams. And yet, I stayed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the deep-rooted belief that I had made my bed and now had to lie in it. But deep down, even then, I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know that the basement would become the prison where all the truths I'd been avoiding would finally come to light. I didn't know that one day Rick would stop pretending and show me exactly who he really was. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because I'd just finished ironing the curtains in the sunroom, a chore Rick insisted I do every week, though they barely collected any dust. The radio was playing soft jazz, and the sky outside was gray and heavy with rain, the kind of weather that made the whole town feel like it was holding its breath. Rick had been in a sour mood for days. He barely spoke to me except to issue clipped instructions. That morning, he'd scolded me for leaving the bathroom light on too long. By afternoon, he was pacing, muttering about money, though we were never in debt. And when dinner came, he barely touched his food, just stared at me across the table as if I'd committed some invisible sin. "I'm going to do laundry," I said softly, more to break the tension than because I needed to. Rick didn't answer. I gathered the basket, walked quietly to the basement door, and switched on the light. The narrow stairs creaked under my feet. The air smelled musty, like old paint and damp concrete. I stepped down slowly, holding the handrail. Halfway to the bottom, I heard the sound that still haunts me, the click of the lock turning behind me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I spun around. The door was closed. No light shone from the kitchen anymore. I climbed back up, confused, and twisted the knob. It wouldn't budge. "Rick," I called. Nothing. I knocked once, twice. "Rick," the door's stuck. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear any sign of him. A step, a voice, even the sound of a chair shifting. Silence. Complete, crushing silence. I called again, louder, then screamed. My voice bounced off the basement walls and came back to me like a stranger's. That night, I stayed on the steps, too stunned to move. The light bulb above buzzed quietly. The only thing I could hear, aside from my own breathing, was the ticking of the old washer's timer. I waited for the door to open, for Rick to appear, laugh, say it was a mistake, that I'd misunderstood, that he was just trying to scare me. But it didn't open. Hours passed. I slid down to the cold floor, my knees drawn up under my chin. The concrete was unforgiving. My hands trembled not from cold, but from something worse, betrayal. Sometime after midnight, I heard the lock again. Keys jangled. The door creaked open. I stood too fast, dizzy from sitting so long in fear. Rick stood at the top, his silhouette outlined by the kitchen light behind him. "Rick, what is going on? Why would you?" He didn't respond, just held out a plate. "I brought you food." I stared at it. A slice of dry turkey, a biscuit, and an apple. No fork, no napkin, no kindness. "Why did you lock me in here?" "You needed time to think," he said flatly, about what he didn't answer. Just placed the plate on the top step and shut the door again. Click, locked. The second time it happened, it lasted longer. 2 days, then 4. And then it wasn't about punishment. It became routine. He stopped answering when I yelled. He'd come once a day, always with food just enough to keep me upright. never said more than a few words, sometimes nothing at all. He left a bucket for waste, but no toilet paper. He took away my wristwatch. Even the light bulb burned out after a week, and he didn't replace it. I started talking to the walls. I told them everything I couldn't say out loud for years. How I missed my sister. How I hated the way Rick called me woman instead of by my name. How I once dreamed of teaching literature, and how that dream had withered under his rules and silence. One night, I found a broken piece of chalk in a dusty corner and began writing on the concrete wall. Not long letters, just words, single thoughts. Freedom, please. I'm still here. It gave me something to do, a reason to stay sane. I don't know exactly how long I was down there before I understood it wasn't temporary, that this wasn't just Rick losing control. This was deliberate. He was isolating me, erasing me. The real horror didn't come from the darkness or the hunger or the cold. It came from knowing he was upstairs, living life as usual, pretending to the world that his wife had gone to stay with her sister or was out of town for a bit. No one checked, no one questioned it. Port Townsend was a quiet place, and we'd kept mostly to ourselves for years. We had no children, no real friends, just polite neighbors who waved from across the fence. Rick knew that. He counted on it. And I had let it happen. Every little concession I'd made over the years had led me here. Every yes, dear, every swallowed protest, every time I ignored my own instincts, I'd given him the blueprint to bury me alive. But even in that silence, something inside me stirred. A flicker, not rage, not yet, but resolve. I was not going to die down there. There's a moment when your body gets used to the cold, when the ache in your bones becomes background noise, and the hunger sharpens into something quieter, something more dangerous resignation. I don't know what day it was. Maybe the 10th, maybe the 12th. I had no way of keeping time down there. Rick never spoke, never looked me in the eyes, just slid food onto the top step and walked away like I wasn't human anymore. The food began to shrink. Some days it was a bruised apple, other times a slice of stale bread. One afternoon, he left me nothing. That night, I cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life, not because I was starving or because my legs were too stiff to stand, but because I realized something horrifying. He didn't care if I lived. I wasn't a wife anymore. I was an inconvenience, a locked-away secret, something to hide. I stopped yelling. My voice had gone hoarse from too many unanswered pleas. Instead, I listened. Every creak of the floorboards above became a clue. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make sense of the rhythm of his life without me. Then one day, I heard another voice. It was a woman's. I remember it vividly, light, playful, high-pitched. She laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind I hadn't made in years. It came from the kitchen. I leaned against the wall, holding my breath. I still can't believe she just disappeared like that, the woman said. Rick's voice responded, calm and composed, the way he always sounded when lying. She left, said she needed space. I guess she found it. The woman giggled. You must have driven her crazy. You poor thing. Then, silence, movement, a clatter of dishes, a soft moan. I turned away from the wall and vomited into the rusting bucket in the corner. He had someone in the house. He brought her there. Fed her, charmed her, maybe even held her in the same arms that once held me. It wasn't just about punishing me anymore. He was replacing me. That night, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just angry. I wasn't just betrayed. I felt something else, fury. Yes, but also clarity. Rick wasn't sick. He wasn't broken. He was calculating. He knew exactly what he was doing. The next few days, I began to examine every inch of the basement. I'd lived in that house for over 40 years and never really looked at this space, this dungeon he now ruled over. There was a small window high on the back wall. It was covered with grime and warped glass, but I could see the light change through it. Morning to dusk. It was too small to climb through, but it gave me something more precious than air hope. I searched through old boxes, rusty tools, anything I could use. I found a bent metal rod, maybe from a broken chair leg. I started working on the hinges of the basement door, not the lock itself, but the pins in the hinges. I had no idea if it would work, but I had time, and nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, the woman upstairs, Chelsea, I eventually learned kept visiting. I heard her name in passing. She'd giggle and call Rick baby. I imagined her blonde, younger than me, perhaps in her 40s, and completely oblivious to what lay beneath her feet. But I heard something else, too. Rick was planning a trip, a weekend away with Chelsea. He mentioned it one morning, his voice thick with amusement. "We'll take care of the paperwork when I get back," he told her. Paperwork. My blood ran cold. Later that night, I listened harder, piecing together phrases: death certificate, missing person affidavit, legal transfer. It hit me like a fist to the chest. He was trying to declare me dead. He'd been planting the story already, telling people I left, that I was unstable. Maybe he'd even written fake letters, all to make it official. If he could prove I was gone long enough, the law would catch up and everything we owned would be his. I wasn't just an inconvenience. I was a liability. I doubled my efforts. Every waking hour, I worked that door. My fingers bled from scraping at the hinges. I used scraps of cloth from an old work apron to wrap them. My knees ached from crawling on the concrete, but the top hinge, after days of work, began to loosen. The night before Rick's trip, he came down with a flashlight. It startled me. He hadn't done that before. He stood at the top of the stairs, shining the beam in my face like a prison guard. "Tomorrow, you'll get your wish," he said coldly. I didn't speak. I just stared back. He turned and left. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway the next morning. It was barely past dawn. I crawled to the door, braced myself, and gave the hinge a sharp pull with the rod. It popped free. I cried, but I didn't stop. The second hinge was tougher. My hands were shaking, my body weak, but I didn't care. I had one shot. If Chelsea came back before I got out, it was over. I jammed the rod in again, twisted hard, and felt the pin shift. The door creaked, and then light. Not much, just a sliver. But it poured into the basement like salvation. I used every ounce of strength I had left, pulled, pushed, kicked, and then suddenly, I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, shaking, alive. I reached for the phone, but it was gone. Rick had taken it. So I did the only thing I could. I stumbled to the front door, out into the morning mist, and ran to Martha Green's house next door. She was just pouring coffee when I pounded on her door, half conscious and filthy. When she opened it, her face went pale. "Linda." I nodded. "I need help," I whispered. He locked me in the basement. I don't think he planned to ever let me out. And then I collapsed in her arms. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on Martha Green's couch, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of cinnamon and lavender. Her old orange tabby cat Jasper, purred quietly at my feet. For one disorienting moment, I thought I was waking from a nightmare. But then I saw the bruises on my wrists, the dried blood beneath my fingernails, the ache in my ribs from days of sleeping on concrete. It hadn't been a dream. Martha returned with a steaming mug of chamomile tea, her hands trembling as she passed it to me. "Linda," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the coffee table, "what in God's name happened to you?" I couldn't speak. My voice had been worn to shreds by days of screaming, then weeks of silence. I simply looked at her and let the tears fall. To her credit, Martha didn't bombard me with questions. She gently wiped my cheeks, called the police, and stood protectively by the door until they arrived. The only thing she asked was if I wanted Rick to know where I was. I shook my head violently. "No, please, don't let him know I'm here." Within 20 minutes, 2 squad cars from the Port Townsend Police Department pulled up to her curb. I remember the moment Officer Jeremy Cole entered the room, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his early 40s. His expression was professional, but his eyes softened when he looked at me. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, kneeling beside the couch, "I'm Officer Cole. We're going to help you, but I need to ask, are you in immediate danger?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. He locked me in the basement. For weeks, maybe longer. He's planning to make people think I'm dead." Those words hung in the air like smoke. Martha gasped, covering her mouth. Officer Cole didn't flinch. He asked a few more questions where I'd been kept, if I had seen anyone else, if Rick had hurt me physically. I answered as best I could. My memory was patchy. My thoughts came in fragments, but one detail was crystal clear. There was a woman. I said, "Her name is Chelsea. I heard her upstairs. He's been bringing her to the house. I think he's planning to marry her, after he gets me out of the picture." That changed everything. By the time the officers escorted me to the hospital for evaluation, they had already dispatched a team to our home. I couldn't believe how fast it all happened. One moment, I was lying on a basement floor, wondering if I'd die in the dark, and the next, I was surrounded by nurses, bright lights, and voices that called me by name again. At the hospital, they checked for broken bones, dehydration, signs of abuse. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Ross, held my hand as she spoke to me, her tone gentle but firm. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, but this wasn't luck. This was strength. That night, under clean sheets and a soft blanket, I slept a full 8 hours for the first time in what felt like forever. When I woke, a nurse handed me a newspaper clipping. Rick had been arrested that afternoon at a lodge in Sequim during what he'd described to Chelsea as their honeymoon preview weekend. They'd found him with falsified documents in his suitcase, forged medical records, a fake letter claiming I'd gone to live in Idaho, and even a draft death certificate signed under a stolen physician's name. He didn't deny it. According to the article, Rick looked calm and emotionless during his arrest. When Officer Cole visited me later that day, he filled in the blanks. "Your husband confessed to most of it. He told me," shaking his head. "He said you were becoming a burden, that he needed a fresh start. He thought if he kept you out of sight long enough, people would believe whatever he told them." My stomach turned. "Chelsea," I asked. She claimed she had no idea. He replied, "She's cooperating. Said she thought you'd left years ago and that Rick was a widower. She's in shock, to be honest." I didn't know whether to believe her, but it didn't matter. The case moved faster than anyone expected. The local media ran the story for days. Widow rescued from basement captivity. The headlines read, "Husband charged with attempted fraud and false imprisonment." I couldn't look at the photos. Not of Rick in handcuffs, not of our house, not of the basement door, pried open by the officers who'd saved me. What broke me, truly broke me, was seeing the list of items they found in his desk drawer, copies of our will with his name forged above mine, a list of my medications and notes about how too much would look natural, and worst of all, a calendar marked with dates labeled final step. He had planned it all. He didn't snap. He calculated. In the weeks that followed, people from town reached out. Some sent flowers. Others wrote letters of apology. Neighbors who wished they'd noticed something, said something, done something. I didn't blame them. Rick had spent years building the perfect disguise. But now, the mask was off, and I was free. Leaving the hospital should have felt like a triumph. The sun was shining, the spring air crisp and fresh, and Martha was waiting at the curb to drive me home, not to the house on Cherry Street, but to her own, where she insisted I stay as long as I needed. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. After years of walking on eggshells, of hiding bruises no one could see, and days locked in the dark, the real world felt too loud, too bright. I flinched at the sound of passing cars. I startled when Martha closed the trunk a little too firmly. Even the feel of warm food in my mouth felt foreign, like something I didn't quite deserve. She set me up in her spare bedroom, a quiet space with lace curtains and a quilted bedspread that smelled like lavender dryer sheets. Jasper the cat curled up at my feet every night, offering wordless comfort. Martha kept her questions few and her kindness steady. She fed me soup and let me sleep. She sat with me during the first nightmares, when I'd wake screaming that the door was closing again. But the part that truly shook me came 2 weeks after I moved in. The phone rang. Martha answered, and when she brought it to me, her face was unreadable. "It's someone from the courthouse," she said gently. "Her name's Judith. Says she's with the Victims Assistance Office." I took the call with trembling fingers. Judith's voice was calm, professional. "Mrs. Anderson, I just wanted to let you know that your husband's bail has been denied. He's being held until trial. But there's more." My chest tightened. More. "There's a second investigation. When we ran his financials, some irregularities popped up, and we discovered he was trying to sell the house." I froze. "But he can't. He forged my signature." "He did. But because you're alive and legally competent, those documents are now evidence of fraud. We've halted the process, and the property is frozen under court order. But Mrs. Anderson," she hesitated. "What? There's a third woman. Her name is Jeanette Ross. She came forward after hearing your story. Said Rick courted her last year, told her his wife had Alzheimer's, that you were no longer present. He was trying to convince her to move in." The room spun. I sank onto the bed, hand clutched to my chest. "He's a predator," I whispered. "Yes," Judith said softly. "But thanks to you, people are finally seeing him for who he is." The line went quiet after that. I handed the phone back to Martha, who wordlessly poured me a glass of water. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, staring out the window at the soft glow of the street lamp. A year ago, I never would have believed I'd be here, free, breathing, able to make choices again. But with that freedom came something else I hadn't expected. Guilt. Why hadn't I left sooner? Why did I stay so long? Why hadn't I seen the danger in the way Rick cut off my friends, or the way he controlled our money, or the way he used silence like a knife. The truth was, I did see it. I just didn't believe I had a way out, and that realization crushed me more than anything. The next morning, I sat with Martha on the porch. She handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You don't have to talk about it. But if you want to, I'm here." I looked at her and finally let the words come. He took pieces of me. Martha, small ones. Over decades, I didn't even notice they were gone until I was empty. Martha reached over and held my hand. "Well, now we fill you back up," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That week, I went back to therapy for the first time in over 30 years. My last experience had been brief and cold. Rick hated that I was talking to strangers. But now I had the space and the will to truly speak. My new therapist, a woman named Dr. Helen Price, listened without judgment. She told me something that stuck with me. Survival is not a weakness. Survival is a revolution. It wasn't just about escaping Rick. It was about reclaiming the parts of me he tried to erase. I started painting again, just watercolors. At first, soft skies, quiet hills. I joined a senior center art group. I even began journaling, something I hadn't done since I was 25. Each entry ended with the same line, "I am not what he made me." Weeks passed, then months. Chelsea, the woman Rick had tried to replace me with, wrote me a letter. Handwritten, shaky, apologetic. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. If I had, I would have helped you. I feel sick just thinking about it. I never wrote back. Not because I hated her, but because I needed to focus on healing myself, not carrying someone else's shame. Eventually, I went back to the house, not alone. Officer Cole offered to accompany me. The home was quiet, sealed in court tape. The flowers in the garden had overgrown. The paint peeled on the porch railings. But it wasn't the house that haunted me. It was the door, that basement door. I stood before it for a long time, remembering the cold, the silence, the lies. Then I asked Cole to help me pry it off its hinges. We did, together. He handed me a Sharpie, and I scrawled one sentence across the wood before we burned it in a metal barrel out back. "You did not bury me. You set me free." After we burned the basement door, something in me changed. I no longer saw myself as a victim. Yes, terrible things had happened to me. Rick tried to erase me, literally and legally, but standing in front of that smoke, rising from the barrel, with the words, "You did not bury me. You set me free," slowly curling into the sky. I felt something I hadn't felt in decades, power, real, quiet power. Still, the nightmares didn't disappear overnight. I'd wake some nights tangled in my sheets, my heart pounding, certain I was back in the basement. But the difference now was this: I wasn't alone. Martha would leave a light on in the hallway. Jasper would nuzzle at my feet. And Dr. Price taught me how to breathe through the panic, to name the fear instead of letting it own me. It was during one of those therapy sessions that the idea came. I want to help someone. I told Dr. Price, someone like me, someone who's still trapped. She looked at me, her expression warm. "Helping others is healing, Linda, but only if you've tended to your own wounds first." "I'm tending," I said, "but I can't just sit here and recover in silence while other women are locked in basements of their own." She didn't stop me, so I started small. Martha helped me draft a letter to the editor of the Port Townsend Gazette. It was short, just a few paragraphs about what I'd been through, how isolation and control had grown over the years until I barely recognized myself. I didn't name Rick. I didn't have to. People knew. Within a week of that letter being printed, I received a dozen phone calls, some from women in town who told me they were proud of me, but others, quieter voices, were calling from across the peninsula, women I'd never met, women with tremors in their voices who whispered, "I think I might be in a similar situation." One woman named Marie, from Port Angeles, told me she hadn't spoken to her sister in 20 years because her husband didn't allow outside contact. She said she hadn't thought of it as abuse. "I thought it was just how marriage works when you get older," she said. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. That's what I thought, too. From that moment, I knew I couldn't stop at just one letter. I spoke with a social worker at the courthouse, and within a month, we formed a weekly support group, Quiet Reclaimers, for women over 50, dealing with emotional, financial, or physical abuse. We met in the basement of a church, fitting, I suppose. Same dark walls, same echo. But this time, we weren't locked in. We were gathered in freedom. At the first meeting, there were only 4 of us, me, Marie, a retired school teacher named June, and a woman named Clara, who hadn't spoken in nearly 15 minutes before she whispered, "He doesn't hit me, but he tells me I'm stupid. Every day, my own husband." I reached out and held her hand across the table. "You're not stupid," I told her. "You're just not invisible anymore." By the 3rd month, our group had tripled. A local news station reached out for an interview. I hesitated. The idea of being on camera made my stomach twist. But Martha nudged me gently. "Your story saved you, Linda. Maybe it'll save someone else too." So I did it. Sitting on that set, bright lights blinding, I told the truth. I told the world what Rick had done, how he used charm to disarm people, how he made isolation seem like protection, how the man people admired had become my jailer. And then I looked into the camera and said the words I wish someone had said to me 40 years ago. If someone is making you small, quiet, afraid, please know this isn't love, and you are not alone. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, women from Oregon, from Idaho, from New York, even from as far away as Georgia. Some told me their stories. Others just said thank you. But the one that broke me came from a girl just 17 who had been watching the interview with her grandmother. "My stepfather has been hurting us for years," she wrote, "but after hearing you talk, my grandma called someone. He's gone now. We're okay. Thank you for being brave first." I cried reading that one, not from sadness, but from a kind of release, a kind of victory I never thought I'd feel again. Rick was still in jail, awaiting trial. The legal system moved slowly, but justice was finally in motion. I didn't check the court updates every day. I didn't need to. What he did would follow him. His masks were off, his lies exposed, and me, I was finally breathing in the light. The letter came in early fall, tucked between an electricity bill and a grocery circular. It was stamped with the seal of Jefferson County Superior Court. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, tracing the edges like they might cut me. Inside was a summons. Rick's trial date had been set. October 12th. It was happening. I sat alone on Martha's porch that evening, the maple trees across the street already shedding their leaves. Their slow drift reminded me of time, how fast it passed when you weren't paying attention, and how painfully slow it moved when you were trapped. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to sit across the courtroom from the man who'd once slid a wedding ring on my finger and later locked me in a room like I was less than human. But I knew I had to. Dr. Price reminded me gently, "This is not for him. It's for you. You have a right to speak, to be heard, to tell the truth. out loud, where it matters most. So I agreed. Martha went with me the day of the hearing, dressed in a dark blue suit and carrying tissues in her purse, even though I hadn't cried in weeks. I wore a soft gray sweater, no makeup, no jewelry, just me, as I was, as I survived. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, the kind of place where lives were quietly sorted between right and wrong, and then they brought him in. Rick. His hair had thinned. His hands were shackled. He wore the beige jumpsuit of a man who no longer fooled anyone. But what unsettled me most wasn't how different he looked. It was how little he did. He didn't glance around, didn't seek me out, just sat straight-backed, like he was still in control. I sat near the front, next to Officer Cole, who nodded at me respectfully, as if to say, "You're not alone." The prosecution laid everything out, his forgeries, the witness statements, the physical evidence from the house, my hospital records, the recordings Chelsea had given the police from voicemails he left her, even the notes he made in the margins of our will. It painted a clear, damning picture. The defense tried their best, suggesting stress, early dementia, even grief over a miscarriage decades earlier. They brought up his career, his community service, how no one had ever filed a complaint before, and then they called me. I stood, walked slowly to the front, swore myself in, and for the first time in a courtroom, with my voice steady and sure, I said everything I had once whispered only to walls and darkness. I was married to that man for over 50 years, and for most of those years, I disappeared. Not physically, at first, but piece by piece, until I forgot who I even was. I told them about the control, the silence, the emotional manipulation. I told them how he kept me from my sister, my dreams, my own thoughts, how he turned our home into a cage, and finally, I told them about the basement, how the concrete floor had become my grave until I refused to die in it. When I sat down, the courtroom was silent. Rick didn't even look at me. The judge called a short recess. As I stepped outside for air, a woman approached me, mid-30s. Nervous eyes, she whispered, "My mom went through something like this. Thank you for saying what she never could." I nodded, heart pounding, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty on all counts: false imprisonment, fraud, attempted identity theft, intent to cause psychological harm to a vulnerable adult. He was sentenced to 18 years without parole. It was more than I expected. And yet, no sentence could ever undo what he did. But it did something else. It validated me. I wasn't invisible anymore. The trial ended, but healing doesn't come with a gavel. In the weeks that followed Rick's sentencing, I often found myself staring at the sky, not searching for meaning, just marveling that I could sit on a porch, breathe fresh air, and not fear a locked door behind me. The simplest things had become luxuries: the wind through the trees, the warmth of a coffee mug in my hand, the sound of my own name spoken with kindness. People in town began treating me differently, not with pity, but with a quiet sort of reverence. At the grocery store, a cashier once handed me my change and said, "You're the lady who made it out." I just nodded. I didn't need to say more. But even with Rick gone, his shadow lingered in strange places. The hum of a washer still made my chest tighten. The clang of metal cutlery, keys, anything could jolt me out of thought. And yet, something deeper was shifting too. The support group I helped start, Quiet Reclaimers, continued to grow. Each week, New women sat in our circle. They brought their stories years of financial control, withheld affection, bruises hidden under sleeves, but they also brought hope. They laughed. They cried. They clutched one another's hands and said, "Me too." One Tuesday, Marie, the woman from Port Angeles, shared that she'd finally filed for divorce after 32 years. We cheered like children. June brought homemade cookies, and someone suggested we plant a garden outside the church, a living testament to our survival. I volunteered to help. Gardening had always been something Rick said was a waste of time, but digging my hands into the soil felt like returning to something I'd lost long ago. Life, growth, purpose. That spring, we planted hydrangeas, lavender, daisies, a whole border of daffodils. Each bloom felt like a small reclaiming. And then one afternoon, as I was pruning dead stems, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Still know how to grow something beautiful." Huh. I turned. It was Nancy, my sister. Older now, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, but her smile was the same. We hadn't spoken in nearly 15 years. Rick had driven us apart, slowly, expertly, until the silence between us had grown too wide. "I saw you on TV," she said. I cried the whole time. I hugged her and felt years of pain dissolve between us. "I'm sorry I stayed away," I whispered. She pulled back and looked me in the eye. "I'm sorry I let him keep me away." That night, we stayed up late at Martha's house, drinking tea, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like coming home to a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Eventually, I moved out of Martha's and into a small apartment near the bluff, where I could see the sea from my kitchen window. I filled the space with light, soft yellow curtains, secondhand paintings, and shelves of books I'd always wanted to read but never had time for. I even adopted a small dog from the local shelter, Minnie, a Chihuahua Terrier mix with more attitude than size. She follows me everywhere now, a little guardian in a fuzzy brown coat. Some nights are still hard. Some days are quiet in the way that makes old pain echo. But I keep moving forward. I am 78 years old, and I have more life in me now than I ever did in my 40s. I never thought I'd live to be 78 and feel more alive than I ever was at 40. Back then, I was breathing. Yes, I was cooking, cleaning, smiling for neighbors. But I wasn't truly living. I was surviving in silence, slowly shrinking in the shadows of a man who made the world believe he loved me while quietly erasing me, piece by piece. Now, my days are mine. I wake up with the sound of seagulls outside my apartment window. Minnie curled at my feet. I walk to the little bakery down the block where the girl behind the counter already knows how I like my coffee. I spend afternoons with women who were once strangers but are now sisters in survival, each of us with scars, each of us still standing. I volunteer twice a week at the women's shelter in town. I sit with women just beginning their journeys out of fear. Sometimes they can't even look me in the eye, and I remember what that felt like, the shame, the guilt, the doubt. But I also remember the day I looked into the mirror and saw not a victim, but a fighter. I remind them of something that took me years to understand. You are not broken. You are breaking free. A few weeks ago, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the State Victim Advocacy Office. They told me that thanks to my public testimony, new legislation was being reviewed, measures that would help older women escape domestic isolation sooner, with stronger protections and emergency housing access. I held that letter in my hands and cried, not because of what Rick did, but because of what I did. I didn't just survive. I turned my pain into purpose. I turned silence into a voice that could shake the walls of a courtroom, fill a church basement with light, and reach into the hearts of women across the country. And now, as I sit here on my porch, the sea breeze rustling through the wind chimes Martha gave me, I realize something even deeper. The scariest prison isn't the one with locked doors and no windows. It's the one where you're told your life doesn't matter, and the greatest escape is believing that it does. To every woman listening to this, whether you're 28 or 78, if someone is making you feel smaller, if someone is dimming your light or controlling your steps, please listen to me. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting, and you are not alone. If you see yourself in my story, I urge you reach out. Speak to someone. Write down your truth. Say it out loud, even if your voice shakes. You do not need permission to take back your life. You only need one moment of courage. That one moment saved mine. And if this story has touched you in any way, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unloved, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Let's lift each other up. Let's build a space where no woman, no elder, no survivor ever feels alone in the dark again. And please don't forget to subscribe, because somewhere, someone is still trapped in silence, and the next story might be the one that sets her free. Thank you for listening. Linda Anderson Port Townsend, Washington, 78 years old, and finally free.